Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 25th, where we are transitioning away from film and talking about short story. All of this included in our fiction section and possibilities for you to be able to write your first paper on. So, as you know, I had distributed possible paper topics. And that said, you can create your own topic if you don't like any of my topics, but you do need to get the topic approved by me ahead of time. And what I did was I generated 4 topics, 2 of them about canon, about one of the works in the fiction section. Do you think that that work should be in the canon? And the reasons why. The why is what's most important. Or do you think that work should not be in the canon? And the reasons why. Or contemporary relevance, though contemporary relevance is oftentimes used in our definition of canon, those works considered by scholars and critics worth literary study, something that's got some quality to it. But while something having contemporary relevance might be a criteria of canon, it's not the only criteria of canon. Perhaps you want to just focus on contemporary relevance so you could identify a work in the fiction section that you think still has contemporary relevance, and of course the reasons why, or that doesn't have contemporary relevance and the reasons why. There are no right or wrong answers here. What's important is your argumentation. I did that very deliberately. And this is a critical paper. You shouldn't be using outside resources. You should be focusing on your own analysis and interpretation. And as the semester progresses, I'll talk a little bit more about the actual construction of writing a paper itself. But as we moved from Citizen Kane and talked a little bit about literature, which in the broadest sense of the word, I guess, is anything that is written. But when we talk about literature, we talk about storytelling, fiction. That's the kind of literature we study in class. And then we talked a bit about how is it that decisions are made for the canon. And while the canon can be subjective because it's determined by scholars and critics and they have their own biases, hopefully there are also some standards of quality that hold up against the test of time. And I think this was illustrated with the 2 stories that were included in our textbook, A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman. And last class we talked a little bit about A Secret Sorrow, which is actually a chapter from a Harlequin romance. And what we saw is that this was a very predictable, trite read. That's not to in any way disparage it if you're looking for escapism or if you're the author and you're looking to generate profit. There's nothing wrong with that either. But it doesn't have a lot of depth. It doesn't have a lot of complexity. It doesn't make us think. Or one of my favorite definitions for a piece of literature is something that you can reread and bring forth new meaning each time. Something that is creative and original. And that's usually not what we find with formula fiction, as the textbook had talked about, or genre literature. In other words, literature that's written following particular criteria and categories, whether it be a romance novel, which is what we were introduced to, but it could have been a Western, it could have been horror. And that's not to say that you couldn't still study these from an academic perspective. There certainly has been some scholarship about the way that relationships have been depicted in romance novels or how gender has been depicted in romance novels. But the writing is probably not sophisticated enough for us to spend a lot of time with in an academic situation, as opposed to a story that has a very similar title but is very different, and that's entitled A Sorrowful Woman. And in terms of thinking about how to read a piece of literature, as I had suggested, you want to think about the author. And Gail Godwin is female. And we're given a little bit of a biography about Gail Godwin, and we find out that, in effect, she is a PhD in English and has won quite a few awards. In other words, she's very skilled at what it is that she does. To look at the date, because that gives us a sense of time period, though a text could have been set in the past or in the future. But if there's no reference to a time within the text, then we assume it's around the time of publication, 1971. And to think about what the world was like in 1971, especially for female, because we have a female author, and because this story is about a woman, a sorrowful woman. And you think about the women's rights movement that was occurring in the 1970s. If you think about the fact of how ultimately artists help to lead, as they oftentimes do, some of the social and political changes that occur and have occurred after they've raised social and political issues. And I think that's very much the case with A Sorrowful Woman. Um, think about titles. Of course, we know that this is about a woman. We know she's sorrowful. We don't know why. We need to read the story. Even the article A, it's not the sorrowful woman, which would suggest one. It's a sorrowful woman, which would suggest one of many. And then how I had asked you to consider that opening quote, that once upon a time there was a wife and mother one too many times. And think about how once upon a time is suggestive of fairy tales. But wife and mother one too many times negates that. There's a negative sense to that. So this is a fairy tale gone awry. Already notice the difference with just that opening line with what we saw with The Secret Sorrow. This opening line requires you to think. And we have to keep this in the back of our mind when we are reading this story. And ultimately, we probably need to reread the story after we get to the end to understand truly what the opening line is about. That this woman feels overwhelmed with the responsibilities of being wife and mother, especially in the late 60s, early 70s, and what those responsibilities and expectations would be. And because we've got a sorrowful woman rather than the sorrowful woman, she's probably not alone. There might be other women who feel this way too. And you might have noticed, I hope, that no names were used in this story. We don't know the names of the characters. We know their titles, wife or mother or woman or man or child. This takes away their individuality. This also helps to generalize so that this isn't just to a specific person or situation. It could be to many. We're told that the settings can be important, is a winter evening. That can be quite negative. Usually the times of day are oftentimes associated with emotions or stages in life, with the morning representing the beginning of life or something optimistic, with midday representing the height of life, or again, something optimistic. Evening, the beginning of descent, which is something a little bit more negative or perhaps older age. And then we have nighttime, which could be death. Authors are aware of these symbols and they might use these symbols, or they might give us these symbols and upset our expectations for what these symbols might mean. But so far, while I'm reading, if I were just beginning my reading, the fact that it's happening on a winter evening, the fact that it's a sorrowful woman, the fact that there are no names, all of this indicates to me that this is negative. And throughout, the husband says he understood. And my question is, does he? And yes, he certainly is supportive, or at least he tries to be supportive. He doesn't offer the support the woman needs. Perhaps he can't during this time period. Certainly the idea of mental illness is embedded within this text, and certainly that's something that would not have been discussed or understood as well as it would be, let's say, today. And that said, he's trying his best. I love the description of him at the beginning, that he was durable. I always think about the tires on my car as being durable, not necessarily how I would think about talking about a spouse. little details like color imagery. The child's eyes are gray, the husband's shirt is gray, and there could be lots of symbols and associations with gray, but gray can oftentimes represent negativity, darkness, depression. It can also be ambiguity, things that are unclear. The episode in which the husband is helping the wife undress, if this were a Harlequin romance, it would be an erotic episode, but it's anything but in this particular instance, with a lot of descriptions about her bra and that it's just hanging there. And think about all of the symbols associated with a bra, that a bra offers support, which is what she's looking for, or that bras are restrictive, which is probably how she feels as wife and mother, and that bras are oftentimes sexual, but that's the last way that we're thinking about it here. And the foreshadowing that occurs, all the little hints about what will happen in the story that we may not even know are going to be little hints until we get to the ending of the story, which might require rereading. For instance, she wants instant sleep. And this is foreshadowing for the ending when she commits suicide. And I know there's probably a couple of you who are listening to this video and saying, what? She committed suicide? Yes, she did. And it's not clearly stated. You need to interpret this. At the very ending, we are told that she went to the cupboard and took what was hers. We know that in the cupboard is where she's been stashing her sleeping medication that her husband has been making in batches that'll last a week at a time. And then we know that when the husband goes into the room, he basically listens to her chest. He's checking for a heartbeat. He rolls back her eyes. He's looking for pupil dilation. He checks her wrist. He's looking for pulse. And then he buries his head in her freshly washed hair in sadness and despair. And the child, oblivious, after all, this is just a small child, saying, can we have the turkey for supper? Because she's engaged in this flurry of activity of housekeeping and caretaking for the family before she commits suicide. So if you didn't get that piece that she committed suicide, you definitely need to reread this story, because that's part of the plot. And the plot is important, but the plot is just the least of it as we continue to go through this. And of course our questions are, why is it when she has a husband who's supportive and a seemingly beautiful child, tender golden 3, is she so unhappy? Certainly she's not experiencing any kind of economic or physical deprivation from what we can see in the story. In fact, she has a very comfortable life, it would seem. But what happens when you're still not satisfied despite the fact that you've got a comfortable life? What if you want more and society doesn't offer you an option for more? That's what this story is trying to examine. And again, you don't have to necessarily agree with the woman's choices as she begins to further isolate herself from the family. And at this point, not only is she taking that sleeping draft that's being made in batches, some more foreshadowing, but she isolates herself from her child. You might say that this negates all responsibilities that she has as a mother, and while she might have justification for isolating herself from her marriage and her husband, certainly not her child. It would be hard to disagree with that. But thinking about how the author wants us to feel about this character, which is a certain level of empathy or sympathy. Think about how the child is described. At one point, he's playing with her, as children do, and he's a vicious tiger. Think about all the associations with tiger, this predatory animal. And he scratches her wrist accidentally, but think about how slashing wrists are so often a common mode of suicide. And again, we wouldn't necessarily know this was foreshadowing of her suicide until we got to the end, and then we had to reread. The fact that, he puts this live life in her palm, this grasshopper, and of course she reacts so violently to it, this insect, this alien thing, which is how she sees her own child, as this alien thing. Not only does she hit the child when she knows that it will be seen, a kind of cry for help, but then she hides in her room, and the husband, again trying to be supportive, hires a nanny, a girl who's perfect because in part she's not pretty, so she's not going to be a sexual threat. And of course the girl is a threat, not sexual, but she's a threat in the sense that the girl can fulfill the duties of wife and mother that the main character cannot. Of course, it's a different situation for the girl. She's doing this as employment. She's getting paid for it. She can make a decision to leave if she wants to. It turns out that the wife feels so much threatened by this girl that the girl is ultimately dismissed. And then the wife moves into the girl's room, a white room. Think about all of the positive associations with white. A new beginning, innocence, but also negative associations. It could be considered institutional. It can be considered bland. And as the woman is alone in her room on a winter afternoon, and if we're carefully reading, we'll see that we've moved from winter evening to afternoon, so we're moving earlier in the day. So my suspicion might be at this point, if this were my first reading, that this is something that's going to be positive, at least for a central character, because we're moving earlier in the day. Spending her time in the room wearing an old sweater from school, probably remembering when she didn't have responsibilities as a wife or a mother. She finally, spends a lot of time in that room with self-care activities such as hairbrushing. Lots of references to hairbrushing. Again, if there's a detail, especially if it's repeated, it's probably important. Also, hairbrushing is reminiscent of fairy tales. Don't forget how we started this story once upon a time, but this is a fairy tale that's going to go awry. But Rapunzel is a very famous fairy tale with hair. Hairbrushing can also be soothing, and there certainly is the idea of depression, but it's not about the fact that the woman has depression. It's about why she's depressed. That's what's more interesting about the piece. She's thinking about writing sonnets, which are poems that have very strict rules associated with them, which we will be talking about as the semester progresses. So you may or may not have understood the sonnet reference, but a sonnet has a strict rule structure in terms of its length, in terms of its rhyme pattern, that's known as the rhyme scheme, in terms of its subject matter, even the number of syllables. And when we're told she's thinking about writing a sonnet, ABBA, that's not ABBA, the 70s rock group. This is how you determine rhyme in a poem, is that you look at the last word of each line, and each time you have a new rhyme, you identify it with the letter of the alphabet. You start with the letter A, and then you move to the letter B with another rhyme, and C, and so forth. So that finally, what you've got is, or what you could have, is a pattern, a distinguishable pattern, such as ABBA. And the woman contemplates, my sonnet can be any number of lines. It doesn't even have to rhyme. So she's thinking about breaking the rules, which makes perfect sense because she was a wife and mother one too many times. She tells her husband at the very beginning, could you read the story to the boy about, the monkey that ate too many bananas? And this idea of too many times, too many bananas, too much of a good thing can be very bad. And one also assumes when she asks the husband to read a story that this is her responsibility, just like the caretaking of the family is her responsibility, and the house upkeep is her responsibility. Things get so bad that she can't even talk with her family. She has notes underneath the door. And as ridiculous as that might sound, wait till we talk about Emily Dickinson and some of the ways that she lived her life in true form. Or even in 2024, I think about the number of people who will text one another even though they're sitting right next to each other rather than talk to one another. So perhaps notes under the door isn't that unusual. And now we move to a new season. We move from winter to spring. And again, I'm thinking renewal, rebirth, at least for this particular character. She's suffocated or feels suffocated by these joyful notes that are under the door. And she went to the cupboard and took what was hers, as I said. And she completes many chores before she commits suicide, showing that she can fulfill the expectations of wife and mother. It's not that she's incapable. It's just something that she no longer wants to do. And the child, as innocent as he is, and as clueless, I suppose, as a child should be, he says something very, very interesting at the ending of the story, saying that she's tired from doing all our things again. If you've ever heard the expression out of the mouths of babes, this child understands on some level, maybe just subconsciously, that she's tired of being wife and mother in a way that the husband doesn't. I mean, he brings her meals in bed. That's wonderful. And she says, I'm the luckiest woman. But that's not the support that she needs. And then, of course, we know the husband is checking the vitals. And then at the ending, the child's question about supper. There are even ending questions at the ending of many of these texts, if you are reading these texts from our assigned textbook, that can give you an idea of how to proceed with reading. Sometimes students say they like to read the questions first to give them an idea what to look out for. Other students say they don't want spoilers, so they want to read the piece first and then they read the questions afterwards. But many of these questions sort of reinforce the idea that a sorrowful woman is much more complex than a secret sorrow. I mean, we spent about a good 20 minutes talking about this particular short story. We've only just, begun to discuss this story. We could spend the entire semester talking about this story and the detail and the nuance associated with it if we wanted to. Not that we have the time to be able to do something like that. We're even told that the opening line, the epigraph, as it's known as, so it even has a term, has a certain level of significance. And we're told that the author wants us to empathize with the woman, even though it may not necessarily appear that way upon an initial reading. And again, you may not necessarily be able to empathize with the fact that she's not able to fulfill her responsibilities in marriage or particularly in motherhood. But the way that this story is presented from her perspective is about a woman who's trapped and how does she find freedom? Unfortunately, this woman is unable to do so. Note that at the end, she reverts back to writing sonnets. Again, very structured, stylized. Knitting things in gray. Again, gray being a negative color. So any kind of possibilities that she was flirting with in her room about new opportunities and freedoms as she's looking out the open window and beginning to contemplate the world outside. And notice how often this woman is basically trapped in the house. The entire story pretty much takes place in the house. Occasionally the husband will take her out to dinner, which again kind of shows that they have a certain amount of disposable income. They send out for the laundry, they're able to hire a nanny. So obviously they're doing well enough financially. So it's not that, she feels trapped because they're economically deprived. There isn't any reference to any kind of physical ailments or any kind of domestic abuse or anything of that nature. So that makes the tale much more complicated. What happens when you're not feeling personally fulfilled, and how do you achieve personal fulfillment? Might I suggest that it was stories like these that helped to bring about some of the changes that have occurred since then, so that a wife and mother need not be the only roles available for female. And while it might be easy to say in 2024, well, why didn't she just get divorced? Think about the stigma associated with divorce during this time period. There's even still stigma today. So that gives you an idea of some of the ways that you could examine a text from an academic perspective. And it also gives you an idea about how a sorrowful woman has a level of depth and complexity and requires rereading in a way that a secret sorrow doesn't. Of course, we can debate whether or not a sorrowful woman or any of the other texts that we will be reading should be included in the canon. But I think you can see that there definitely is a difference in quality. And I kind of liken it to grading a paper, which is subjective, but also there are some objective criteria. If you remember in your syllabus, I had given you a grading rubric of what an A might look like, or a B or C, which we will review as the semester progresses. So the idea is that there are some objective elements in something that is subjective, which I think is something that we can find within the canon itself. But this is the first story, A Sorrowful Woman, of several that we'll be reading that are possibilities for your paper. And of course, Citizen Kane is also a possibility for your paper because this is a film and literature class. So you can make decisions as to which to write about. And your paper is due approximately midway through the semester. That puts us at the 21st of October. I know that after that date, I get a little bit anxious. I certainly have no problem with granting you an extension, but you want to have some sort of evaluation by the midpoint, I would think, for a more formal assignment. And I encourage early papers. As I have that rolling deadline so that at any point in the semester you can submit in a paper and you have the option of rewriting it for a higher grade. I just ask that you submit in the revision along with the original evaluated copy. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do that. For your second paper, you are going to be engaged in a similar exercise, but it won't be due until the very ending of the semester. Chances are you won't have a chance to rewrite it, but chances are you won't need to rewrite it because you would have learned how to write a paper the first time around. And the second paper will be due on our second unit, which is drama, that we will eventually be heading into, talking about how do we evaluate drama when we read it and how do we evaluate drama when we watch it. And you'll have similar kinds of paper topics to talk about either performance or text as you did with paper number 1. And then when we get into our very last unit of the semester, that's poetry, we won't necessarily have time to write a paper about poetry, but we will have a final exam. It'll be open book, open note, and the bulk of it will be devoted to poetry. So that's how you get to discuss poetry. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of those pieces as the semester progresses, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what's going to be coming up. So, in terms of thinking about next class, and luckily I have been able to find some links for free for these pieces. The Story of an Hour, which I know that was assigned in the earlier set of readings that we had done. However, I wanted us to read it from an academic perspective. If you'll remember, the earlier set of readings were about how to read literature and how to write about it. And also Rose for Emily, the great short story. And I do have a interview from the author for us to read about his perspective on his piece. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find a free link for the interview, but I did find a free link for the short story. Keep in mind, all these works are included in our textbook, and if you don't have a copy of the textbook, there's a copy on reserve in the GCC library. So I've spent a good amount of time talking about papers and talking about A Sorrowful Woman. So I wanted to ask you at this point for today's attendance question, which would be due on Friday the 27th. So certainly you can ask for an extension if you'd like. What questions, if any, do you have about paper number 1? What questions, if any, do you have about paper number 1? And certainly you can say you have no questions at this point, and that'll satisfy your attendance. But if you've got questions, certainly ask them. As I indicated, as the semester progresses, I plan on talking a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper. Hopefully that'll be review for you. Hopefully this is something that you've talked about in your previous English classes. And I'll also have a handout that I'll review that I will be posting in our syllabus and other documents about how to write the critical paper, which is what you're doing. You're not relying on outside resources. You're relying on your own interpretation. But I'm hopeful that now at this point in the semester, now that we have a film under our belt, so to speak, and one short story in its entirety, A Sorrowful Woman, that you're beginning to contemplate. But if you don't think that you want to write on either Citizen Kane or A Sorrowful Woman, fret not, because there are other works coming up, including the works that we will talk about next class, The Story of an Hour and A Rose for Emily. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And again, what questions do you have for paper number 1? If you don't have any, just say you don't have any, and that will suffice. And I will see you next class. Take care. Bye-bye.